Methods of psychology, research methods of psychology. The main objectives in this lesson are to understand what is scientific research and its importance, research methods used in psychology, which are interview method, survey method, and experimental method. Research in psychology, the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. This is known as research. Presents a more specific model of scientific research in psychology. The researcher formulates a research question, conducts a study designed to answer the question, analyzes the resulting data, draws conclusions about the answers to the question, and publishes the results so that they become a part of the research literature. Because the research literature is one of the primary sources of new research questions, this process can be thought of as a cycle. New research leads to new questions, which lead to a new research, and so on. The figure also indicates that research questions can originate outside of this cycle, either with informal observations or with practical problems that need to be solved. But even in these cases, the researcher would start by checking the research literature to see if the question had already been answered and to refine it based on what previous research had already found. People have always been curious about the natural world, including themselves and their behavior. Science grew out of this natural curiosity and has become the best way to achieve detailed and accurate knowledge. Keep in mind that most of the phenomena and theories that fill psychology textbooks are the products of scientific research. Scientific research is often classified as being either basic or applied. Basic research in psychology is conducted primarily for the sake of achieving a more detailed and accurate understanding of human behavior. Applied research conducted primarily to address some practical problems. Now that we have understood scientific research, let us look at different methods of research in psychology. They are interview method, survey method, experimental method. Before we discuss about the interview method, we must understand what is a questionnaire and its applications. Questionnaire. A questionnaire is a research instrument consisting of a series of questions for the purpose of gathering information from respondents. Questionnaires can be thought of as a kind of written interview. They can be carried out face-to-face, by telephone, computer, or post. Questionnaires provide a relatively cheap, quick, and efficient way of obtaining large amounts of information from a large sample of people. Data can be collected relatively quickly because the researcher would not need to be present when the questionnaires were completed. This is useful for large populations when interviews would be impractical. However, a problem with questionnaires is that respondents may lie due to social desirability. Most people want to present a positive image of themselves and so may lie or bend the truth to look good. Interview method. Interviews are from different questionnaires as they involve social interaction. Unlike questionnaires, most researchers need training in how to interview. Researchers can ask different types of questions, which in turn generate different types of data. There are multiple methods of conducting an interview. They are structured interview, unstructured interview, focus group interview. Quite often, interviews will be recorded by the researcher and the data written up as a transcript, a written account of interview questions and answers, which can be analyzed at a later date. It should be noted that interviews may not be the best method to use researching sensitive topics, as people may feel more comfortable completing a questionnaire in private. Interviews take many forms, some very informal and others more structured. Structured interview. A structured interview is a quantitative research method where the interviewer provides a set of prepared, closed-ended questions in the form of an interview schedule, which he or she reads out exactly as worded. The interviewer will not deviate from the interview schedule except to clarify the meaning of the question or probe beyond the answers received. A structured interview is also known as a formal interview, like a job interview. Strengths are: structured interviews are easy to replicate as a fixed set of closed questions are used, which are easy to quantify. This means it is easy to test for reliability. 2. Structured interviews are fairly quick to conduct, which means that many interviews can take place within a short amount of time. This means a large sample can be obtained, resulting in the findings being representative and having the ability to be generalized to a large population. The limitations are: structured interviews are not flexible. This means new questions cannot be asked impromptu, that is during the interview, as an interview schedule must be followed. 2. The answers from structured interviews lack details, as only closed questions are asked, which generates quantitative data. This means a researcher won't know why a person behaves in a certain way. Unstructured interview. Unstructured interviews do not use any set questions. Instead, the interviewer asks open-ended questions based on a specific research topic and will try to let the interview flow like a natural conversation. The interviewer modifies his or her questions to suit the candidate's specific experiences. Unstructured interviews are sometimes referred to as discovery interviews and are more like a guided conversation than a strict structured interview. They are sometimes called informal interviews. Strengths are: unstructured interviews are more flexible, as questions can be adapted and changed depending on the respondent's answers. The interview can deviate from the interview schedule. 2. Unstructured interviews generate qualitative data through the use of open questions. This allows the respondent to talk in some depth, choosing their own words. This helps the researcher develop a real sense of a person's understanding of a situation. They also have an increased validity because it gives the interviewer the opportunity to probe for a deeper understanding, ask for clarification, and also the interviewee to steer the direction of the interview, etc. The limitations are: it can be time consuming to conduct an unstructured interview and analyze the qualitative data. Employing and training interviewers is expensive and not as cheap as collecting data via questionnaires. Focus group interview. Focus group interview is a qualitative approach where a group of respondents are interviewed together, used to gain an in-depth understanding of social issues. The method aims to obtain data from a purposely selected group of individuals rather than from a statistically representative sample of a broader population. The role of the interview moderator is to make sure the group interact with each other and do not drift off topic. Ideally, the moderator will be similar to the participants in terms of appearance, have adequate knowledge of the topic being discussed, and exercise mild, unobtrusive control over dominant talkers and shy participants. A researcher must be highly skilled to conduct a focus group interview. The strengths are: group interviews generate qualitative narrative data through the use of open questions. This allows the respondents to talk in some depth, choosing their own words. This helps the researcher develop a real sense of person's understanding of situation. Qualitative data also includes observational data such as body language and facial expressions. They also have increased validity because some participants may feel more comfortable being with others as they are used to talking in groups in real life. The limitations are: the researcher must ensure that they keep all the interviewees' details confidential and respect their privacy. This is difficult when using a group interview. Group interviews are less reliable as they use open questions and may deviate from the interview schedule, making them difficult to repeat. Group interviews may sometimes lack validity as participants may lie to impress the other group members. They may conform to peer pressure and give false answers. We must also focus our attention towards possible errors such as the interviewer effect. Because an interview is a social interaction, the appearance or behavior of the interviewer may influence the answers of the respondent. This is a problem as it can bias the results of the study and make them invalid. Design of interviews. First, you must choose whether to use a structured or non-structured interview. Next, you must consider who will be the interviewer, and this will depend on what type of person is being interviewed. There are a number of variables to consider: gender and age. This can be a big effect on respondents' answer, particularly on personal issues. Personal characteristics. Some people are easier to get on with than others. Also, the accent and appearance, example clothing, of the interviewer can have an effect on the rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. Also, the language the interviewer uses should be appropriate to the vocabulary of the group of people being studied. The interviewer must ensure that they take special care when interviewing vulnerable groups such as children. Ethnicity. People have difficulty interviewing people from a different ethnic group. Once we have identified the design of our interview, then we can go ahead and conduct it to obtain data for further analysis. Let's look at the survey method. What is survey research? Survey research is a quantitative and qualitative method with two important characteristics. First, the variables of interest are measured using self-reports. In essence, survey researchers ask their participants, who are often called respondents in survey research, to report directly on their own thoughts, feelings and behaviors. Second, considerable attention is paid to the issue of sampling. In particular, survey researchers have a strong preference for large, random samples because they provide the most accurate estimates of what is true in the population. In fact, survey research may be the only approach in psychology in which random sampling is routinely used. Beyond these two characteristics, almost anything goes in survey research. Surveys can be long or short. They can be conducted in person, by telephone, through the mail or over the internet. They can be about voting intentions, consumer preferences, social attitudes, health, or anything else that is possible to ask people about and receive meaningful answers. Although survey data are often analyzed using statistics, there are many questions that lend themselves to more qualitative analysis. Let us look at the uses of a survey. A survey can be used to investigate the characteristics, behaviors, or opinions of a group of people. These research tools can be used to ask questions about demographic information, about characteristics such as gender, religion, ethnicity, and income. They can also collect information on experiences, opinions, and even hypothetical scenarios. But how do researchers go about collecting information using surveys? A survey can be administered in different ways. In one of the methods known as structured interview, the researcher asks each participant with the questions. In the other method known as questionnaire, the participant fills out the survey on his own or her own. You have probably taken many different surveys in the past. Although the questionnaire method tends to be the most common, surveys are generally standardized to ensure that they have reliability and validity. Standardization is also important so that the results can be generalized to the large population. Let us look at the different types of surveys. Surveys can be implemented in a number of different ways. The chances are good that you have participated in a number of different market research surveys in the past. Some of the most common ways to administer surveys include mail. An example might include an alumni survey distributed via direct mail by your alma mater. Telephone. An example of telephone survey would be a market research call about your experience with a certain consumer product. Online surveys might focus on your experience with a particular retailer, product, or website. At-home interviews. The US Census is a good example of an at-home interview survey administration. Advantages of survey research. One of the big benefits of using surveys in psychological research is that they allow researchers to gather a large quantity of data relatively quickly and cheaply. Surveys allow researchers to collect a large amount of data in a relatively short period. Surveys are less expensive than many other data collection techniques. Surveys can be created quickly and administered easily. Surveys can be used to collect information on a broad range of things, including personal facts, attitudes, past behaviors, and opinions. Disadvantages of survey research are: one potential problem with written surveys is the non-responsive bias. Experts suggest that return rates of 85% or higher are considered excellent, but anything below 60% might have a severe impact on the representativeness of the sample. Poor survey construction and administration can undermine otherwise well-designed studies. The answer choices provided in a survey may not be an accurate reflection of how the participants actually feel. While random sampling is generally used to select participants, response rates can bias the results of a survey. The social desirability bias can also lead people to respond in a way that makes them look better than they really are. Advantages: a survey is more efficient, less expensive, easy to create and administer, and has diverse uses. The disadvantages are: It is subject to non-response bias. It may be poorly designed. The limited answer choices can influence the results, and it is subject to social desirability bias. Experimental research method. How exactly do researchers investigate the human mind and behavior? While there are a number of different research techniques, the experimental method allows researchers to look at cause and effect relationships. In the experimental method, researchers identify and define key variables, formulate a hypothesis, manipulate the variables, and collect data on the results. Extraneous variables are carefully controlled to minimize a potential impact on the outcome of the experiment. It involves the manipulation of variables to establish cause and effect relationships. The key features are controlled methods and the random allocation of participants into controlled and experimental groups. An experiment is an investigation in which a hypothesis is scientifically tested. In an experiment, an independent variable, the cause, is manipulated and the dependent variable, the effect, is measured. Any extraneous variables are controlled. Let's look at the different types of experiments. There are a few different types of experiments that researchers might choose to use. The type of experiment chosen might depend on a variety of factors, including the participants, the hypothesis, and the resources available to the researchers. Let us discuss about them. 1. Lab experiment. A laboratory experiment is an experiment conducted under highly controlled conditions, not necessarily a laboratory, where accurate measurements are possible. The researcher decides where the experiment will take place, at what time, with which participants, in what circumstances, and using a standardized procedure. Participants are randomly allocated to each independent variable group. The strength of experimental research are: it is easier to replicate, that is, copy a laboratory experiment. This is because a standardized procedure is used. They allow for precise control of extraneous and independent variables. This allows a cause and effect relationship to be established. Limitation. The artificiality of the setting may produce unnatural behavior that does not reflect real life, that is, low ecological validity. This means it would not be possible to generalize the findings to a real life setting. Demand characteristics or experimental effects may bias the results and become confounding variables. 2. Field experiment. Field experiments are done in the everyday, that is, real life environment of the participants. The experimenter still manipulates the independent variable, but in real life setting, so cannot really control extraneous variables. An example is 𝗂𝗵𝗺 hospital study on obedience. The strengths are: behavior in a field experiment is more likely to reflect real life because of its natural setting, that is, higher ecological validity than a lab experiment. There is less likelihood of demand characteristics affecting the result, as participants may not know they are being studied. This occurs when the study is covert. The limitations are: there is less control over extraneous variable that might bias the results. This makes it difficult for another researcher to replicate the study in exactly the same way. 3. Natural experiment or quasi-experiments. Natural experiments are conducted in the everyday, that is, real life environment of the participants. But here, the experimenter has no control over the independent variable as it occurs naturally in real life. Strengths are: behavior in a natural experiment is more likely to reflect real life because of its natural setting, that is, very high ecological validity. There is less likelihood of demand characteristics affecting the results, as the participants may not know they are being studied. This can be used in situations in which it would be ethically unacceptable to manipulate the independent variable. Example: researching stress. The limitations are: they may be more expensive and time consuming than lab experiments. There is no control over extraneous variables that might bias the results. This makes it difficult for another researcher to replicate the study in exactly the same way. The experimental process. This process involves psychologists, like other scientists, utilizing the scientific method while conducting an experiment. The scientific method is a set of procedures and principles that guide how scientists develop research questions, collect data, and come to conclusions. The 4 basic steps of the process are: forming a hypothesis, designing a study and collecting data, analyzing the data and reaching conclusions, sharing the findings. Now that we have understood how the experimental research method works and what are the types of experimental methods that can be used in research, advantages and disadvantages of experimental method. The advantages are: it provides researchers with a high level of control. 2. There is no limit to the subject matter or industry involved. That is, it can be used in a wide variety of situations. Experimental research provides conclusions that are specific. 4. The result of experimental research can be duplicated. 5. Natural settings can be replicated with faster speeds. This allows the researcher to have a greater control of the extraneous variables which may exist as well, limiting the unpredictability of nature as each variable is being carefully studied. 6. Experimental research allows cause and effect to be determined. 7. It can be combined with other research methods. Now, let us look at the disadvantages of experimental research method. 1. Results are highly subjective due to the possibility of human error. Because experimental research requires specific levels of variable control, it is at a higher risk of experiencing human error at some point during the research. The experimental research can create situations that are not realistic. 3. It is a time-consuming process. For it to be done properly, experimental research must isolate each variable and conduct testing on it. 4. There may be ethical or practical problems with the variable control. Sometimes there are variables that cannot be manipulated as it should be so that the results can be obtained. 5. Experimental research does not provide an actual explanation. Experimental research is an opportunity to answer a yes or no question. It will either show you that it will work or it will not work as intended. 6. Extraneous variables cannot always be controlled. Although laboratory settings can control extraneous variables, natural environments provide certain challenges. 7. Participants can be influenced by their current situation. Now, let us summarize the main points of this session. Scientific research is often classified as being either basic or applied. Basic research in psychology is conducted primarily for the sake of achieving a more detailed and accurate understanding of human behavior. Applied research is conducted primarily to address some practical problem. Once a researcher has designed the study and collected the data, it is time to examine this information and draw conclusions about what has been found. Using statistics, researchers can summarize the data, analyze the results, and draw conclusions based on this evidence. The methods used by researchers can be interview, survey, or experimental research method.